First, I want to talk about kind of loading the question here, the myth of culture fair test. There's a lot of talk about different test formats that might be culture fair or culture free. And a lot of times people talk about this in terms of figural matrices type test. So this is one of many types of tests that are typically labeled as nonverbal, but they're really a figural analogies format. That's just one kind of nonverbal assessment. So why do people want to use these kinds of tests? Well, they're purported to be culture fair, to reduce the influence of culture on performance. They're supposed to measure more innate ability not affected by education. And then finally, they're expected to increase diversity. So these are some pretty compelling selling points, but they're not always they don't always pan out. So some of the problems that we identify with these figural tests is that there's no such thing as a culture-free test, and even culture fair is kind of a stretch. So the very idea of a multiple choice test or testing in general or giftedness is a cultural concept. It's something that we've developed as part of our civilization or part of our culture, and so it's going to vary by cultural group, and no matter how hard we try, our tests are always going to be inherently cultural. So we have to think about reducing culture, the cultural influence or unfair cultural influence, but we can't eliminate it. And it's also important to notice that language loading is not the same as cultural loading. So we have been very effective in measurement in reducing the language demands of test, and that would be the nonverbal format. But that's not the same as eliminating cultural loading. So all abilities and skills are developed, so we're not born being able to do analogies, although it'd be very interesting if we did. But we have to figure out how to do that. We learn that in education and in everyday life. It's things that we have to develop. So anytime someone's making a claim about measuring innate abilities or inborn abilities, that's not going to be accurate because these abilities, no matter what they are, have to be developed. Another problem with using nonverbal tests that are figural analogies is that these figural tests, so to some extent it measures general reasoning ability, but to another extent is also measuring this really specific kind of reasoning that's unique to this item format. And so when you identify students on this test, you're going to get students who are skilled in reasoning type formats that are not as relevant to typical academic areas. So compared to verbal and quantitative ability, it's less relevant to instruction. And then finally, ironically, many schools report that they don't actually see an increase in diversity and selection. And before you think that's just the folks who are talking to me, I want to show you some data that we have looking at different formats. So on COGAP 7 and 8, all of the K-12 batteries include nonverbal formats. They just measure verbal and quantitative content with a nonverbal format. So we looked at the difference in score performance on students taking those tests who are English learners and non-English learners. And what you can see in this figure is that the figural test, or the nonverbal battery, actually showed the largest differences between English learners and non-English learners compared to the quantitative and the verbal tests that are measured with pictures. And so, in fact, we see the biggest differences, and if we did identification based on these tests, we would see the largest differences with figural reasoning. When you control for things like ethnicity and poverty, you actually see bigger differences. So if you control for those influences, you can actually eliminate the impact of English learner status on quantitative reasoning. You reduce it on verbal, but even when it's reduced, it's significantly reduced on figural. So ethnicity and poverty do strongly influence figural reasoning. There's still the largest difference between English learners on that test. So if you think about it, that's pretty ironic that, we're trying to use this nonverbal format that has no language and no language demands, and yet it has the largest differences, even just English learner status, even controlling for ethnicity and poverty that's more common in that group of students. In terms of planning for instruction, so this is a study that I did a few years ago looking at which tests were most relevant to planning for instruction for English learners and non-English learners. And you'll see that I also compared non-English learners who are Hispanic and white, so to kind of separate that ethnicity and language learner status. And what we looked at was the correlation between the 3 COGAT batteries and achievement in math and reading. And basically, to summarize all these correlations, we've found that the best predictor of mathematics achievement, no matter what your demographic group, was quantitative reasoning, was not figural reasoning, as some would claim. So whether you're an English learner, a Hispanic non-English learner, or white, the best predictor is quantitative reasoning. For reading, the best predictor is verbal reasoning, which is not really surprising in terms of predicting outcomes, right? So predicting outcomes and learning content that involves language is best predicted by a reasoning battery that assesses your ability to think and identify patterns in language. So in fact, if you use the nonverbal or figural test, you would not identify the students who had the strongest abilities in verbal reasoning and who would gain the most in reading achievement. So although we see that the correlations are weaker for English learners, the same battery is still the best predictor of later outcomes. So for planning instruction, there's no difference in which test we ought to measure, but there are differences in how we should use these tests. So I will talk about that in the last section of today's talk. So some conclusions from this section. So nonverbal tests are not a silver bullet solution, especially if they're a single format, which I'll talk about in this next section. The decrease in the correlations, like what I just showed you, means that you select a lot of students who actually wouldn't benefit from the program or be as successful in a program as other students would be, even controlling for equity and diversity issues. Third, the promise or rewards of diversity often don't materialize, and we saw that in the data. And then finally, most importantly, there's no clear connection between figural reasoning skills and most of the enrichment or gifted and talented options that people are offering. So if you're going to select students who are particularly good at abstract reasoning and not particularly good in verbal or quantitative reasoning, you need different kinds of services for those students than most schools provide.